As you can probably see from the images, I'm going to be speaking at two very radically distinct ends of a scale of technology. But I wanted to begin by thanking Lukas for the invitation to participate in this conference and for providing me with what turned out to be, I think, a slightly more complex set of provocations than I had first imagined. For, we could say, of course, space matters in so many ways, and particularly when considering what Lukas cast as what you termed today's global reality. So you situated the project at the nexus of space mattering and global realities. So as a historian, then, much of my current work tries to reflect on this very nexus, we might say, of architectural space and the geopolitical or territorial transformations informing those very global realities, including attempting to identify the ways in which architectural practices and theories have responded to very different experiences of space. And so space, as we'll see, experienced both very locally or sort of proximately to the body, and space in the sense of a radically transformed social and technological environment, precisely that figure of the collapse of space so powerfully rendered in the image of the whole Earth from outer space. So what I thought I would offer today are two brief vignettes from opposite poles of a larger body of research, actually a book project that is called Outlaw Territories, Environments of Insecurity, Architectures of Counterinsurgency, 1966 to 1979. I can come back to that. But I think that each of these vignettes speaks in a different manner to pressures exerted on architectural conceptions of space, and as we'll see, their protagonists do so by formulating modes of sort of counter-occupations of space, and again, at two very distinct ends of a technological sort of scale, and as we'll see, also not always two particularly progressive ends. And so the first concerns the open land communes that emerged in Northern California in the mid-1960s as environments in which to quite literally test out alternative modes of life, and even for developing strategies for living during what they imagined might be a sort of post-apocalyptic moment, a moment when access to advanced technology was actually no longer possible, as represented on the left. The second concerns the Aspen Movie Map, a project developed by the Architecture Machine Group at MIT a decade later, which was a very heavily funded project, and a project that forms a sort of significant landmark in the history of so-called virtual space. And just to say an opening for me at stake in looking at these practices or these projects, and trying to unpack or read how such attempts to think about the occupation or the inhabitation of space differently reflects, or as we'll see, is sort of symptomatic of larger historical transformations and how they impact both the human subject and the discipline of architecture. And that, sort of broadly speaking, is the concern also of that book project. But each case study hopefully indicates how, to cite Lukas's request, how I understand as relevant matters of space. So my first example, as I mentioned, is the open land communes. This is the cover of a later manifesto. And this did not emerge, we could say, within the discipline of architecture, but it does offer one of the most remarkable attempts to forge a counter-occupation or a counter-inhabitation of space, one intended quite explicitly as a critique of the impact of architecture, of normative architectures upon one's body and one's psyche. And it's key theoretical document, which you see here, Open Land, a manifesto, was also not written by architects, but by the communards of both the Morningstar Commune and Wheeler's Ranch, the two key communes in this chapter of the book. The open land movement emerged in Northern California in the mid to late 1960s in reaction to what its early proponents, Lou Gottlieb, who was a member of the band The Limelighters, and Raymond Sender. Raymond Sender was an important protagonist in the history of electronic music, was part of the San Francisco Tape Music Center, but emerged in response to what they called cybernation after cybernetics and automation. So responding at once to the imminent possibility that human labor was rendered unnecessary on account of automation, and that those same technologies harbored the threat of atomic and nuclear warfare, and with it they imagined this forced return to a pre-industrial condition, the communards adopted an ethos of voluntary primitivism, a type of performance of survival strategies or of anticipatory sort of experimental testing of alternative forms of life. And central to this testing were attempts to cede private property rights to a domain involving communal stewardship of the land, hence the title Open Land. Is basically a land free from rent, land open to anyone who wished to live there. And their attempt then was to make land, as I mentioned, rent-free, but more importantly, in their minds, to open a space without governmental regulation, or as they put it, with no authorities and no rules. Of course, a utopia that we can certainly talk about later. So offering her impression of Wheeler's Ranch, a journalist called Sarah Davidson recalled that there was a sign near the community garden reading, "Permit not required to settle here." Many took up this call to occupy land free of charge, building, as we see here, makeshift structures, or setting up temporary dwellings from tents and teepees to customized school buses and vans within this highly ambiguous territorial zone. The dwellings, as Davidson wrote, of the scene she encountered are straight out of Dogpatch, old boards nailed unevenly together, odd pieces of plastic strung across poles to make wobbly igloos with round stovepipes poking out the side. These are her words. Most, she said, had dirt floors, though the better ones have wood. So the occupants themselves had a similarly poverty-ridden, even pre-industrial or sort of theatrical appearance, wearing, as she explained, hillbilly clothes with funny hats and sashes, outfits she also described as pioneer clothes. So exodus from official systems of managing land and the built environment, from property rights and trespass laws to building codes and health and safety regulations, was not, of course, as easy as declaring permit not required to settle here. Indeed, the sign served less as a performative or speech act in the sense theorized by J.L. Austin, actually freeing the land from the need for permits, than it did as a polemical and political gesture. And the local authorities quickly fought back, giving rise to what came to be known as the Code Wars, and with them an accelerating escalating set of tactical and counter-tactical maneuvers between the commune on the one hand and the local police and state governing bodies on the other. After initially trying to charge, to arrest them for harboring dangerous persons, then repeatedly rounding them up and arresting them for health and safety violations, local government agencies eventually bulldozed the ad hoc settlements at both sites, and so it was quite literally a type of battle over these alternative occupations and managements of space. So it was in this context that Open Land, a manifesto, was written around 1970, a text recounting that these structures had been a principal means for articulating and testing alternative modes of life, and they were visual as well as they were spatial, to be clear. But they were strategic vehicles in their attempts to withdraw from the state's regulation of the environment, weapons then in the battle over opening land. As more people arrived, the manifesto recounted, Sonoma County started a broad-based policy of repressions, including a punitive and discriminatory enforcement of the health and building codes. And here, it's interesting, of course, the degree to which it resonates with the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street. Of course, the state didn't really care about the health and safety of the communards so much as they were seeking a way of eradicating these alternative settlements. And I quote here, even teepees and tents were disallowed, they go on to report, going on to note the state's acts of rezoning, the properties revoking rights of way, instituting new laws against the formation of non-normative households, and other tactics to break up the commune. And the vehemence of the state's response then, of course, indicates that at stake was far more than ensuring the health and safety of those adopting this lifestyle of voluntary primitivism. So one section of the manifesto entitled Our Beleaguered Homes further outlined their ethos of self-build, no-code homes. So it says, how about building yourself a house? No, you don't need money, architects, plans, permits. Why not just use what's there? Restrictive codes on home buildings, they insisted, make it just about impossible to build a code home that doesn't sterilize, insulate, and rigidify the inhabitants, so it falls down in the first windstorm, the second one won't. Dirt floors are easy to keep clean, domes are full of light and air. So if the cost of materials and do-it-yourself ethos certainly informed the non-normative character of these ad hoc constructions, the manifesto reveals that the teepees, lean-tos, tents, open-sided A-frames, tarpaulins, tree houses, geodesic structures, vans, all these things, were not simply a product of a lack of building expertise, although this did sometimes factor in. What they called their philosophy of architecture was developed at both of these communes, worked against many central tenets of architectural modernity, functional distribution of programmatic elements like bathrooms, kitchens, bedrooms, dining room, etc., use of modern technologies and materials, standardization, rationalization, and mass production, structural stability. That is, and this is what I sort of argue, it identified key points within the design process in which contemporary forms of governmentality, of biopolitical forms of governmentality, impinged most directly upon the subject, where techniques of power were most evident within the organization and regulation of space. So rejecting normative and scientifically justified approaches to housing, not only to housing, but also to health, hygiene, education, sanitation, birth rates, and labor, open-land communards were not, just to stress, fighting for access or equitable inclusion within the system. Rather, they were actively withdrawing from the institutions, practices, and spaces through which micropolitical techniques of power had developed again under a modern form of governmental rationality. They were withdrawing from the points at which this logic systematically met the body and the psyche of contemporary subjects in their everyday lives. Open land was thus implicitly questioning the relation between the state's more benevolent role in ensuring the health and safety or health and welfare of its citizens and the forms of environmental or spatial control it exerted over them in the name of maintaining productivity, or more precisely, maintaining profitability for the capitalist machinery. So these spaces, again, to reiterate, were crafted then as vehicles for testing the occupation of a counter-environment, tactical weapons in the war against the state's administration of dwelling and hence of bodies through regulatory codes. So my second example takes that same cybernation, as I said, to the sort of opposite extreme. ArcMac, Architecture Machine Group, I'll shorten as ArcMac. ArcMac's Aspen movie map was an experiment in surrogate travel, and it stands not only as a landmark in the history of architects' involvement in developing so-called space, or so-called virtual space, but quite literally as a precursor to contemporary paradigms of spatially managed data and interactivity via desktop computer interfaces, modes of interaction all too frequently celebrated as enhancing individual agency or choice, and this is certainly their rhetoric. This is actually from a slightly earlier part of the book, around a project called Interact, which was a device, a research project taking these teletype devices into African-American neighborhoods in major cities like Boston to extract data. So as with many ArcMac research projects, it was funded in response to the so-called urban crisis of the 1960s in America and on account of US concerns regarding insurgent groups in Vietnam, Latin America, and the Middle East, demonstrating how architectural expertise might be brought to bear within interdisciplinary research groups working towards developing highly militarized counterinsurgency measures. And part of what I look at is the way in which that those counterinsurgency tactics developed for Latin America and Southeast Asia were refracted back onto American urban populations. Funded in this case by the Cybernetics Technology Division of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, in the wake of the 1976 Entebbe hijacking, the movie map was a computer-controlled video disk-based system that simulated movement through a virtual environment by drawing upon a multimedia database. As student researcher Robert Moll explained, users, and here implicitly soldiers, are able to learn about an unfamiliar urban space by traveling around at will through sequences of photographic footage and helicoptering above dynamic aerial photos and reference maps. Helicopters and bulldozers, of course, both key technologies in the war in Vietnam. While traveling, they could access other data sources, from what they called micro-documentaries, historical photographs, and interior shots to data on statistics, such as cases of beer consumed per week and numbers of beds. With regard to the anticipatory spatial knowledge the interface was able to convey, Moll concluded, movie map training leads to superior wayfinding competence in the real setting. In principal investigator Andy Lippman's words, the goal of this hyper-cinematic technology was to create so immersive and realistic a first visit that newcomers would literally feel at home or that they had been there before. Speaking more directly to its military applications, he added, DARPA realized the need after Israeli soldiers practiced for the recovery of an airplane hijacked to Entebbe by using an abandoned airfield made up to look similar. So with the movie map, the Israeli Defense Forces' now legendary physical mock-up of the airline terminal in which the hostages were held was to be replaced by a virtual space produced through or within electronic media. The movie map project appealed to the Department of Defense on the assumption that computers would achieve an environmental simulation much faster and at much lower cost, allowing the military more effective advanced knowledge of hostile territories. So as Lippmann explained of the movie map, the driver or map reader was presented either with sequential photographic images of Aspen, the small town in Colorado, or through switching to another channel with a digital animation produced through computer-synthesized replicas of those same images. Through controlling the speed, route, turning, viewpoint, and type of information accessed, the driver could undertake a simulated drive, what they called surrogate or vicarious travel. Switching to an aerial view routine, he or she could also choose to hover over the terrain and zoom in or out of maps stored in the database. Following the nomenclature of Disneyland, Moll referred to these two modes as travel land and map land, emphasizing the ease of switching between them. It was even possible to switch between fall and winter via a so-called season knob, causing leaves to disappear and snow to appear and vice versa. Indeed, the system was set up to refunction spatio-temporal distinctions such as here and now, near and far, now and then, real and virtual, all of which now seemed to belong to a pre-electronic topology. So to produce photographic images for the system, ArcMac went to Aspen and filmed every street using 16mm Bolex L stop frame cameras equipped with a wide-angle lens and set at 90-degree intervals, and as you see here, mounted on the rig on the roof of an automobile. The cameras were triggered to shoot one frame every 10 feet by a fifth wheel training behind. Triggering the camera by distance, not time as would be conventional in a film, allowed for further manipulation over apparent speed by the user of the movie map. Travel velocity was thus independent of the rate of filming, being determined by the presentation rates of individual video frames, and so important here again was not just that the system could simulate space, but that users could experience the control of time. So the animation component of the movie map was developed by a student named Walter Bender using his quick and dirty animation system, or QUADUS. Deploying the same interactive navigation tools and spatio-temporal logic as its filmic component, and designed to match the film footage exactly through careful registration of frames, so he could flip back and forth, QUADUS was developed, as Bender put it, specifically as a supplement to the movie map. Unlike its filmic counterpart, however, QUADUS could, as he explained, fill in where practical reality left off. The system permitted a level of editing, or what he called systematic selection, of information not easily achieved in film, a capacity that could emphasize or de-emphasize certain components, and hence direct attention. Let's go over this bit. So in addition to the two modes of surrogate travel and being able to helicopter above the aerial photograph and maps, movie map users could access ancillary information that, as Lippmann put it, had been stored in the buildings or in locales in the environment. Using ArcMac's Spatial Data Management System, or SDMS, the movie map thus also demonstrated potentials for storing accessing and managing data within a virtual three-dimensional space in which, and I quote, the particular organization corresponds to the physical layout of real space. In fact, Lipner explained of this experimental spatial filing system, now, of course, a ubiquitous computer interface experience, this data is stored behind the facades of buildings or in locales and is retrieved by driving to it. One could thus gain access to information not readily available to the naked eye of a visitor to Aspen. With adequate reconnaissance, that is, the system's data content was potentially higher than that of naked vision. To retrieve data in Travelland, and I'm sorry, this is from one of the dissertations, to retrieve data in Travelland, the driver would touch a particular facade or live site, causing the driving sequence to stop, a close-up photograph of the building to appear as a transition to other data sources, or in the Quadrash you would see the sort of billboard photograph would appear. Then you have a Votrex phonemic voice synthesizer announcing the building's name, and a new set of touch-sensitive pictograms appeared listing available data. Lippmann referred to these facades as providing a natural interface between driving and using the system as a means for accessing spatially stored data. Here, all too literally and seemingly without irony, a building's facade was deployed within a new type of man-machine interface, a transformation which stands in retrospect as a potent allegory of the loss of face-to-face interaction in the electronic milieu. So the nature of that ancillary information, what they called cultural access routines, was highly symptomatic. By way of example, Lippmann pointed to the fact that the town's vital statistics are stored, naturally enough, in town hall. The 1981 demo called the Interactive Movie Map, a surrogate travel system, spoke even more symptomatically of the system's intent. The only site visited in any detail was City Hall's police facilities. After entering the facade, we are shown successively a security guard, a T-shirt labeled Crime Crushers, a suspect description form, the Aspen Police Crime Crushers textbook, an Aspen police officer's belt buckle featuring the relief of the aspen tree from the area's famous forest, a man wielding a rifle, and a short interview. I think we're treating police duties first as a human being and then as professional police officers, he tells us. We then cut to a poster of the 1973 crime film Serpico, featuring Al Pacino as a good New York City cop who had gone undercover to weed out rogue elements in the force and back out onto the street. This was also the example of ancillary data pointed to by Nicholas Negroponte in his 1995 bestseller, Being Digital. In 1978, the Aspen Project was magic. You could look out your side window, stop in front of a building like the police station, go inside, have a conversation with the police chief, dial a different season, get guided tours, helicopter over maps, turn the city into animation. Ivers Negroponte argued in this context, Ivan Sutherland's famous sketchpad was the big bang of computer graphics. It was with the Aspen movie map that multimedia was born. So the multi- or intermedia character of the movie map had further ramifications. The multi-channel data sources and distinct representational modes encountered as one switched between Travelland and Mapland were not regarded by ArcMac researchers as detracting from the effectiveness of the movie map, but rather as helping a user reconcile multiple forms of spatial knowledge in a more synergistic manner than unmediated vision allowed. No one is fooled into thinking the video display is a window onto live reality, Moll concluded, but to his mind, that so-called gap to reality was not a limitation. Duality of representation, he reported, allowed the integration of different understandings of the same thing. The dual representation, he reiterated, seems to promote a synergistic cognitive mechanism, now acting in the service of what he called, translating earlier research by Kevin Lynch in cognitive mapping into an updated model of environmental simulation, cognitive space. Virtual space within the movie map, that is, was not understood to be merely a poor copy or degraded version of real space, even if its two primary channels, that of Travelland and Mapland, were believed to have affinity with the means by which subjects gained information about the environment. Moll even argued that it could not be taken for granted that the real environment is the best medium for conveying the most important information. So to conclude, in 1998, Michael Neimark, a CAVS student in the late 1970s who worked on cinematography for the movie map, presented a paper describing his movie map projects. beginning with Aspen, then moving to that of Karlsruhe, home to the ZKM, Banff, home to another media center, and related panorama projects such as Be Here Now for UNESCO, World Heritage sites like Jerusalem, Dubrovnik, Timbuktu, and Angkor. All attempted to simulate place by creating modes of telepresence. While acknowledging that computer simulations could not represent everything, that experience within them would never be the same as being there, he came to the conclusion that place, or its simulation, was not ultimately the point. As he put it in terms that might give us pause, whoever controls representation controls all. That conventional architecture and urban design were less effective environmental and perceptual tools than other modes of controlling representations of space had been evident to ArcMac. Indeed, at stake in the design of the movie map system was precisely learning how to control representation through experimenting with electronic tools of environmental simulation, including learning how to render them less apparent, how to render their operation less apparent. In Being Digital, Negroponte explicitly connected the Aspen movie map not only to the police and the Entebbe hijacking, the later indicating the degree to which these prosthetic environments, or environmental doubles, were haunted by the geopolitical instabilities they sought to control, largely, of course, those in the Third World or Global South. In addition, and seemingly without irony, he connected the project to Hollywood, noting that whatever system was developed would need the full photorealism of a Hollywood stage set to convey a real sense of space and feel for the surrounding environment. Given their long-standing role in creating effects of cinematic derealization, Hollywood stage sets might not typically come to mind as an environment conveying a real sense of space or place. But at stake was precisely the overcoming, or at least the rearticulation of these binaries, such as reality and representation, material and virtual, presence and telepresence. Moreover, it was not just Hollywood illusions that were at work in the movie map, but a technique of switching back and forth between photographic or filmic representation and computer animations, a switching that served to train users to overlook any such distinction. Operating at the forefront of advances in multimedia technologies, this research entailed simulating the appearance of interacting freely with that system, even of facilitating choice and agency. As Lippmann acknowledged to Stuart Brand, the movie map was the project from which ArcMac derived their definition of interactivity. It was a notion of interactivity, as I've been tracing, that entailed not, and this, as with the open land communes, not an opening of or onto new types of political space within which a subject could act with expanded personal choice or agency, although that was certainly the dominant rhetoric deployed here. Behind the language of interactivity and personalization was the search for an ever more intimate knowledge of the human subject, a paradigm emerging from the trenches of psychological warfare and soon to be deployed all too successfully by private industries searching for new marketing strategies. While deploying the rhetoric of freedom and choice then, and certainly in the regard to movement in space, the paradigm of interactivity it produced was able, with some precision, to create a means of suspending that subject within a control mechanism geared towards perceptual training. It was a closed world masquerading as an open one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felicity. This was dense and full of information. I was quite amazed. You showed basically two projects, the Open Land and the Aspen movie map. And you brought in the term in the very first projects of cybernetics. Maybe you could help me out with passing this out. This is a phenomenon to me, because the term cybernetics has, on the one hand, it was mentioned in the connection, in the context of these kind of almost movement back to primitivism, you called it, and let's say an antagonistic distancing from the rest of society in a very non-technological environment on the other hand. So this is the cyber nation, I think what they called it. And the second project was basically the cyberspace, how it was then later adapted. For me, it's always puzzling when I'm dealing with cybernetics. The word cyber is Greek, and Kybernesis basically means the art of navigation. It comes from the seacraft. It's a
steering and control.
It's art of steering or navigating over the sea. And then particularly in the late 40s by Norbert Wiener, it was applied to data transfer, communication,
Yeah.
both in man and machine. And it seems to me that it, especially in the 60s and 70s, and this is definitely your field of interest and research, that it went in two different ways. On the one hand, the kind of very affirmative, let's say, if we give names to it, it's Kevin Kelly, the kind of affirmative, what can happen, what can we do with it?
Yeah.
And then maybe in the other one, which follows more the, so Kevin Kelly would be more here, while in the other direction where we saw the open land and the cyber nation, it goes into the extreme like Ted Kaczynski, for example, the kind of the Thoreau-like redrawing from society.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's up with this friction? I don't get it. Maybe you can help me out.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and it's an excellent question, and it's not.
Can you use the microphone?
Yeah, okay, I'll use the microphone. The open land communes, I actually wasn't really trying to present them as an entirely progressive, liberated space, and so the Ted Kaczynski and the longer version, I problematized the withdrawal from the government as having this sort of double-edged sword, of course, because other mechanisms of power always return to, in effect, replace official forms of governmentality or even democratic processes with something else. This is this was one of the most troubling legacies of the hippie movement and itself. But in a very practical sense, I mentioned very briefly that Lou Gottlieb, had been a musician, electronic musician, and Raymond Sender had been part of the San Francisco Tape Music Center. They'd also both, along with Stuart Brand and many others, had been part of this very legendary Trips Festival in San Francisco, which was a light electronic, LSD-driven electronic environment, and so for them, these are characters who really encountered at close proximity new technologies and reacted, very badly. And I would sort of put that in dialogue in some way with my work on groups like Ant Farm, who went the other direction, went to Xerox PARC and went to IBM and tried to push the most advanced forms of communication technology to progressive ends. Yeah, so these characters are, as I mentioned, they're entirely haunted by firstly the loss of what they see as the sort of dignity of labor, and so this sort of intense manual labor. They brush their teeth once a week with baked eggplant and things like this. Like this absolute withdrawal from modernity was an incredible paradox, certainly in the United States and amongst a group of highly privileged, educated, white middle class youth. So the cybernation, the cybernetics is haunting them both in terms of, they understood themselves to be the first generation who were going to have to really fully account for automated processes, what they imagined would be a total loss of the dignity of labor. I think is the term I used. Yeah, so they're recognizing the sort of forces of cybernetics as they would come to pervade one's everyday environment, not just the military establishment and weaponry and things like that. So that's what they're responding to. I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but that's why cybernation becomes so important to them. It's not the only way, of course, that one can do with technology, which is why I pointed to the ant farm example. But I think, to come back to the Ted Kaczynski, there's a whole range of other very, very problematic aspects of the open land communes. For instance, I mentioned the sort of pioneer aesthetic of their dress. What is this identification with 19th century settlers? What is their identification with Native Americans? What is their identification with people living in slums in third world countries? What is their identification with forced modes of primitivism? They were, of course, choosing this voluntarily, as it's called voluntary primitivism. That's their sort of tactical form of operating. So for all of those reasons, we have to really put a lot of pressure on that withdrawal. Yeah, that withdrawal is not simply one into a type of utopian space, even if that's what they imagined they were doing. But what interests me about these communes, as opposed to many others, as thousands of communes, of course, is that their crucial tactic to, in their minds, undermine the capitalist system was this figure of free rent, they saw rent and property values as at the core of the, in sort of contemporary social injustices, and that is what the state responded so violently against. It was the other sort of precision with which they had identified key loci of power. And so, I mean, I mention that because I don't think Ted Kaczynski, going into the forest and, bombing scientists, this is not what they're trying to do. Yeah, they're operating in a very different way to something like that. But I do think that that it's important to articulate the sort of proximity of some of these forms of withdrawal and attempts to produce new community structures, even if they are non-governed, supposedly non-governed, from those far more sort of individualistic, anti-society practices. It's a good thing to put on the table. It's a very good thing.
That was one of the two extreme points of this cybernetic discussion that we continue.
Yeah.
Question from the audience.
About the movie map, I wanted to ask, do you regard the movie map as a form of counter-mapping?
I mentioned counter-occupation of space, and so occupation in this case of a counter space, we could say, a type of simulation or double, of so-called real space, because they were mapping real spaces. They weren't inventing spaces. They were trying to develop a technology to to produce a déjà vu effect, to make soldiers feel like they had been there before and knew exactly where to go. So I think it is, we could say it is a, it's hard to say counter-mapping. I mean, I would hesitate to use that a little bit given the history of map-making and its relation to warfare and imperialism. So I don't know that it's that. I think it's actually part of that logic. So it's not really counter to that logic, even if it's counter to conventional occupations of space. It's not counter to mapping. It's a map in a very real sense of the term, I think. It's a good question, though, yeah.
And the last question, quick answer. I think you raised your hand.
Thank you for bringing up cybernetics and discussing it, because I feel that is a completely misunderstood term. It's one of the most. Yeah. I mean, even looking into it, I was drawn into the friction between Georgi Kepes in the Center for Advanced Social Studies and the Machine Group. This fracture. Well, Machine Group becomes the Media Lab, and that's the ABS barely, continues to exist, but in a major struggle. And I almost feel that the misappropriation of cybernetics, being characterized as an electronic, media-based practice that is about control, whereas Kepes described it with Bateson in mind, described it as a mode of controlling, of self-regulation. A circuitry for self-regulation, nothing to do with electronics. It's the flow of information between humans. I think that Bateson really
that's a good point.
Nails it down. And so I'm wondering, do you find that to be potentially a productive discussion again, to rehash this definition of cybernetics? Obviously, we're bringing it up, but...
I'm just trying to... the arc of this book, I'll try and answer your question, but the arc of this book, begins here and actually goes through environmental politics in the early 70s, around the Stockholm Conference in 72, in which, of course, cybernetic models of ecological systems are, absolutely at stake, as are management models of then controlling those and regulating them, and goes from there to some of the counter demonstrations, and into UN Habitat in 1976 in Vancouver, and then later into like the Ford Foundation, all these systems trying to govern global environments. Ends up in two case studies in MIT, the Urban Systems Lab, and then the Aspen Movie Map. And so I situate that because for me, both are very much at stake. It's not, it's an excellent point to bring in, because their ambitions of non-governance, which would be without cybernetics in effect, or without any type of feedback-based logic at the social level, don't work, cease to work very quickly, and you get like intense environmental catastrophes in the open land communes, because firstly they insist on following models like returning their feces to the ground, and they end up getting dysentery and incredibly ill, and so there's very complex questions at stake at that very intersections of governance, cybernetics, environmental questions. Ecology, systems-based logics, and there are, there is a famous environmentalist called Chuck Herrick, who was part of the Ecology Action Group, and other architects involved in trying to regulate their space, and Gottlieb and Sender would have nothing of it. They insisted that the land would train the people to self-regulate with the land, and if too many people got sick and died, then so there's a real question also about the ethics of care at stake, and how that's operating. No, but it's a really good thing to point out, these other semantics of.
There's many more questions, but we take a break. We take a 15-minute break, and then we're back here with Marcus Wiesen and the panel. Thank you all.